evening. Welcome to Live from Prairie Lights. I'm Lindsay Park. Tonight we're pleased to welcome Karen Bender, who will read to us and talk about her terrific new collection of short stories, Refund. Rebecca Lee says, every once in a while a book steps onto the stage and convinces readers all over again that literature is the great companion and interpreter of life. This is one of those books. This is the book of the season and the book everyone should read who wants to understand the depth and capability of the short story. Recently noted in the Week magazine among books exploring the power of money and also making an appearance at number 5 on the LA Times bestseller list, Refund has garnered lots of attention has been featured in People, O Magazine, and More Magazine. Karen Bender is the author of Like Normal People, which was an LA Times bestseller, a Washington Post Best Book of the Year, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writer Selection. Her second novel, A Town of Empty Rooms, was published in January 2013, and her short stories have also appeared in Best American Short Stories, Best American Mystery Stories, and New Stories from the South, and have won 2 Pushcart prizes. She has received grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Rona Jaffe Foundation. She has taught creative writing at Tunghai University in Taiwan and the MFA programs at Antioch, Los Angeles, and Chatham University in North Carolina. Bender is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, which is where she met her husband, novelist Robert Anthony Siegel. She frequently returns to Iowa City to teach for the Iowa Summer Writing Festival, and we're always glad to have her here when she can be here. Please help me welcome Karen Bender.
Thanks. I'm so glad to be here. I always love being in Iowa City, which just feels to me the center of everything good. It feels like the place where I really want to come and just be part of the conversation of becoming a writer. And so it's just really thrilling to be here and share this story with you. And thank you for Prairie Lights for being an incredible bookstore and one of the great sacred chapels of reading and literature in our country. This book is one that I always wanted to publish. I'd started writing stories first, and one of the stories in the collection is one of the first stories I wrote for Workshop many years ago, A Chick for My Dream Life. And so it's just thrilling to have this as a book, finally. I didn't know this would be a book about money originally. It was something that I answered as a response to, I had gotten an NEA grant, and they asked, what are you writing? Which is one of those questions that, I think writers kind of hate, right? It always makes me nervous. And I said, just sort of off the cuff, I'm writing a book about money and worth, and what is it? What are different definitions of worth? Which is kind of scarily what is actually on the book jacket now. And this is something that was about 10 years ago. And so it was something that I kind of had in the back of my mind, and I'd written the stories Refund and Theft at that point. And then, as I kind of continued on writing the stories, there was a recession of 2002, there was a recession of 2008, and you really saw how money became this really defining factor, of the decade, and how it affected people, everyone I knew, and my own family, and just all these different ways. So, so that was kind of the start of the book. And I personally feel like a story, I've written 2 novels, and this is my first story collection, but I feel like a story is the form I'm most happy with. It feels like the place my subconscious feels happiest, and it feels in a way a story has effect, we process it a different way than a novel. It feels like it has the effect of a dream in a way that a novel can have, but a story has in a way that I think is kind of special. So I'm going to read, I'm not going to read all of Refund, I'm going to read part of it. And then I'm happy to answer questions about it, or anything about stories or anything. Refund. They had no contract. It would be a simple transaction. A sublet in Tribeca for the month of September. 2 bedrooms and a terrace, $3,000. They were almost 40 years old, children of responsible middle-class parents, and they had created this mess out of their own desires. Josh and Clarissa had lived for 12 years in a dingy brick high-rise in the Manhattan neighborhood of Tribeca. They had been lonely, met, married, worked at their painting for years, presented their work to a world that was indifferent, floundered in debt, defaulted on student loans, began to lie to their parents about their financial status, and lived in a state of constant fear. They decided once to do miniature medieval paintings that no one would care about but themselves, for the art was just for themselves anyway. Or taking the other tack, decided to do something so deplorable it would have to sell for a truckload of money. They decided to go into pet portraiture, which could fund their real art, and bought ads in local papers, whereupon they found that pet portraiture was a crowded field, and one in which the local masters were competitive and vengeful. In high school, she'd wanted to have a painting in the Met. Now she was trying to figure out how to borrow paints from her artist friends and cleverly not give them back. They lay in bed at 5:30 in the morning, listening to their 3-year-old son, Sammy, hurtling toward the first sunbeam with the call, "Hello. Ready now? Hello." The wistful, hopeful cry made their blood go cold. One of them stumbled toward the relentless dawn, inevitably tripping over the trucks that Sammy had lined up in hopeful parades, convinced that there was somewhere wonderful to go. Their subsidized low-rent apartment was located in a 70s high-rise where they'd braved the abandoned, crumbling warehouses and hefty rats for a rent so cheap they could not afford to live anywhere else. But then the neighborhood changed. They were on the strip of land known as Tribeca. They're building a few blocks south of Canal, 6 blocks north of the World Trade Center, and now there were lofts selling for $20 million, new restaurants with glossy, slim customers posed as though in liquor ads, movie star neighbors moving in such rarefied circles they were never actually seen. The building owners were giving government subsidies, which meant the tenants' rents were low, but the owner had said he would buy out of the program the next year, and thus turn their low-rent apartments into million-dollar condos, and effectively send the 1,000 tenants out onto the street. Walking into their own building, they heard shrill arguments about the misbehavior of companion animals, feuds about laundry hoisted prematurely out of the dryer. The residents were on edge because they were doomed. Josh and Clarissa now skulked through the neighborhood with the cowed posture of trespassers. Soon it would be time to send their son to a preschool. In the park sandbox, mothers talked about Rainbows, the most expensive preschool in the area. Those who had been turned down or could not afford the school spoke of it with a strangled passion. One mother claimed she had stormed out when the director had asked to see her income tax statement during an interview. But another mother, whose son was a student there, leaned toward Clarissa one day after admiring Sammy's exuberant personality and said, "That's the only place where they truly treat the children like human beings." This statement had propelled Clarissa through the doors of Rainbows to observe a class. The director, dressed in flowing silk robes and with large lidded eyes that made her resemble a woodlands creature from a fairy tale, walked Clarissa through the airy rooms. The director said the children particularly enjoyed medieval studies, which apparently meant the children dressed up as kings and queens. Clarissa watched the children of successful lawyers, doctors, executives, and various moguls stack blocks, roll trucks, and cry. One child had tried to hand her a block. When she smiled at him, a teacher gave her a laminated set of rules for class observation. Number 5 was, "Do not engage with a child who tries to talk to you. It interferes with their work." She was ashamed that she had smiled at the child, and that shame convinced her that the school was the only place for Sammy to go. $10,000, said Josh, so he can scribble? No, no, no. She mailed in the application anyway, and when she received the acceptance, she felt it was a sign of some greater good fortune. Their son gazed at them with his beautiful, pure brown eyes, his future gleaming, unsullied, new. At least visit the other schools, pleaded Josh, and she tried. At one, she peered through a square window in a door to see a crowd of children screaming to be let out. One child punched in a security code. A red light flashed, the door opened, and he shot out, to the roaring approval of the others. That was it. They had enough room on their visa for the first tuition installment. Oh, They loaded it on. Then Josh heard about a job for the two of them teaching art at a small university in Virginia, 3 weeks paid in September, accommodations for all of them in a hotel. They could hurl the money toward Sammy's tuition. Their apartment would be empty for a month. It occurred to them they could sublet their apartment and pay off part of their substantial debt load. Let's charge a fortune, said Josh. Josh's college friend, Gary, an investment banker, delivered the tenant to them. I think you can get $3,000, he said. Their rent was $550 a month. Josh wrote the ad, fabulous Tribeca apartment, 2 bedrooms, terrace, $3,000 for September. Gary sent his friends a mass email, and the call came the next day. My name is Kim. Gary gave me your name. He says you have apartment to let. I live in Montreal, and I'm looking for accommodations in the city for September. Right, Clarissa said. Thanks for calling. Well, we're by the Hudson. Beautiful views, wood floors. We have a dishwasher. She paused. Down the block, she said carefully, is Nobu. Nobu, said Kim solemnly. There was silence. I've known Gary for 3 years, Kim said. We met in the south of France with his friends Jana from Paris and Juan from Brazil. We were in town for the day with the Beaujolais Festival. We became friends. Now we follow the Michelin Guide all over Europe together. We have a race to see who has the most frequent flyer miles. I have 67,000, but he has more. She paused. I want to go to Nobu. I want to go with my friend Darla. She's my best friend. I want to walk to all the restaurants there. Now it's not fancy, Clarissa said, alarmed. I want to walk to Montrachet. Kim wanted to send the money immediately. She magically wired $3,000 into their checking account, and that was that. It was September 1st, 2001. Kim held the keys to their apartment. They checked their ATM as they headed out of town. The $3,000 registered on their account. Josh whistled when he saw it. They drove toward a month's employment, a couple in front, a child in the car seat, across the bridges out of the city. She and Josh held hands. Clarissa turned once to look back at the city, the skyline rising, glittering, frozen, and grand in the clear autumn light. She had dropped Josh off to look at televisions at Best Buy when she heard the news on the car radio. Her body startled. Howard Stern's show came on, and the tone of the host was terrifying, lost and humorless. We know who did it, said a caller, and we need to go kill them. Her hands were trembling, so it was difficult to grip the wheel. She raced back to the store where the staff and customers stood, statues, wrapped, in front of the television screens. She stood with the group in the electronics section, in front of dozens of screens. They saw the towers on fire, a giant tower buckled on the screen in front of them, frail as a sandcastle. Grown men around her yelled, "No," in shocked womanly voices. Sammy was immediately attracted to the picture. Booming sound, said their son. The fact they lived by the trade center made them objects of concern. I'm so sorry, said strangers. They stood awkward, marked with an awful, bewildering look. Where would you have been? Asked someone eagerly, as though they had been potential victims and they craved an intimacy with the disaster. We would have been 1 block away, Clarissa said. Her arms became cold. This admission felt strangely like bragging. It occurred to her that others thought they could have been dead. She remembered they had signed Sammy up to attend the preschool on Tuesday, Thursday mornings. Around 9 o'clock, they would have been steps away, bringing Sammy to his first day of school at Rainbows. Somehow the day ended. They drove down the dark streets. Almost no one was on the road, and it seemed that everyone had fled to their homes. They passed the stores that resembled giant concrete cubes, Walmart and Target and Old Navy, the buildings strangely devoid of windows like bunkers. A student had said to them, Providence had brought them here. You have been blessed, the student said in a respectful tone before inviting them to church. Clarissa declined, though she kept thinking about this. She asked Josh, do you think we were blessed? No, he said, we're not special. Don't feel special. It could be us next time. It could be us any minute. She looked out the window. This was not the answer she wanted. Why do you say that? She said. How do you wake up in the morning? How are you going to walk Sammy down the street? He reached for her hand. Her fingers felt strange, rubbery. She clung to them, bewildered by the raw facts of fingers' hair. Hello, said the voice, aggrieved 3 days later. Hello, Clarissa, it's me. Hello, asked Clarissa. Who is this? I was on my way there. I wanted to go to the observation deck. I went the wrong way on the subway, or I'd be dead. I got out, and there were all these people running. Then I saw the second plane. I started running, and I couldn't get the windows closed, because I'd never seen windows like yours. I'm sorry, Clarissa whispered. I'm sorry. They said there's a bomb under the George Washington Bridge, Kim shouted. I can't get the ferry to New Jersey. It's closed. Is there a heliport in Manhattan? I'll pay anything to get to a heliport. Can you tell me? I don't know, said Clarissa. I don't know where one is. There was a pause. I'm leaving town, said Kim. I can't stay here. And I want a refund. I want it all back. One day before they left Virginia to return to New York, Clarissa received an email in regards to refund. I have not heard from you in regards to the status of my refund. Perhaps you're too busy to think of me now. All the hotels are giving refunds. Also free rooms in the future and suite upgrades. My pet peeves are injustice and dishonesty. I know when I'm being treated fairly. You did not tell me certain facts about the apartment, which was, I'm sorry to say, filthy. Black goo all over the refrigerator. I had to wear plastic gloves to keep my hands clean. Darla and I planned our vacation for a long time. We are best friends. We were going to buy the same clothes, go to the newest restaurants. People would admire us and say, who are those glamour girls? Her hair is red and more beautiful, but I will admit I have nicer legs. We want to start a commotion. I expect to receive a payment of US $3,000 within a week. When they got out of their cab at Canal Street, the border between civilian New York and the war zone, they unloaded their luggage by the rows of blue police barricades. Let's see your ID, said the state trooper, standing trim and noble in his brown uniform surrounded by pans of homemade cookies. Do you live here or do you have reservations? They looked at him. The restaurants gave us lists of people who have reservations, he said, pulling out a piece of paper. They offered their driver's licenses and the officer agreed. This was where they lived. He offered to give them a ride to their building. The car floated by the gray, scrolled buildings, the streets deserted, simply a stage set, built quickly then abandoned. The sky had become pale, sickly orange and gray. There were too many police cars posted at corners. Sirens pierced the warm air. There were American flags everywhere, as though everyone was desperate to have the same thought. People hurried down the streets carrying groceries, pushing strollers. Some were wearing surgical masks. Kim had left in great haste, sheets piled in the living room, a pale lipstick in the bathroom sink. Clarissa picked up the lipstick and touched the tip. The color was a frosted pink. She thought they should make some grand entrance. They should say something profound to each other, but she merely listened to the sound of their presence ring through the apartment. There was the smell, unlike anything she'd smelled before, burning concrete and computers and office carpets and jets and steel girders and people. There was nothing natural about the smell. It tasted bitter and metal in her mouth and blew through their neighborhood at variable times. The mornings began sweet and deceptive, yet the afternoons became heavy with it. The girls at the American Lung Association table gave her a white paper mask and told her there was nothing to worry about, but to keep her windows closed and stay inside. She walked against a small stream of people wearing paper masks. The streets were dark and shiny, the sanitation trucks spraying down the street to keep the dust from lifting into the air. A man walked by in a suit and a gas mask. Did you know something they did not? Where did he get the gas mask? When she ran into neighbors, anyone, Modesto, the maintenance man in the building, the counterman at the bodega, mothers from the playground, she moved toward them, the fact of their existence, her fingers like talons. It did not matter she did not know their names. How are you, they asked each other, and it seemed like they were saying, I love you. How are you, Modesto asked. Where were you, she asked. How is your apartment? I'm glad to see you. The meetings were hushed and tender, and then with further discussion she found that the neighbors had become deformed by a part of their personalities. The mothers who had been angry now were enormous, stiff-shouldered with anger. The mothers who were fearful were feathery, barely rooted to the ground. Why do they close the park for asbestos, said one angrily, when before it was just full of piss and shit. She stood with Josh that first week, looking out their closed window at the line of dump trucks taking the rubble to the barge. They sat sweaty, greasy in their living room, listening to the crash of the crumbled buildings as they fell into the steel barge. The swerve of the crane sounded like huge, screaming cats, and when the heavy debris crashed into the barge, the sound was so loud they could feel it in their jaws. They drifted quickly from their damp new gratitude for their lives to the fact they had to live them. 1 week after their return, they sat beside the pile of bills that accumulated. They sat before the pile as though before a dozen accusations. She had been hostage to the absurd notion that by acting young, she would not age. The part-time jobs, a haphazard routine, had kept them mired in a state of hope, which now made it difficult to get off the odd welfare state that was an adjunct freelance part-time job. We were fools, he said. All of her previous thoughts seemed the musings of a fool. She rubbed her face, which was damp with sweat. Her mind seemed to have stopped. There was a short pause outside. The crane operators stopped for a moment of silence whenever they found part of a body. She looked out and saw one of the workers holding his hat. She opened a window. Kim wants all her money back, she said. He lifted his hands in bewilderment. Dear Kim, we are so sorry for your terrible experience. We're so glad you were not harmed. This is indeed a terrible time for the world. You did stay in our apartment for 10 nights, and I have calculated this stay at current hotel rates at $150 a night. We're also deducting a fee for cleaning the apartment, as you did leave a window open, letting some contaminated dust inside. This leaves you with a refund of $1,000. The first installment, and $20, will arrive in a week. Peace be with you. She took a deep breath and pressed send. She took Sammy to his first day of school. She walked down the street past the taped flyers. The local day spa was offering free massages for firemen and policemen. A neighborhood restaurant offered a $25 prix, macaroni and roast beef. Eat American. Donations to Ladder 8 for missing firemen accepted. Dozens of Xerox faces of the missing clung to lampposts wrapped with tape. They stared into the street. Loving husband and father, our dear daughter, worked on the 87th floor, worked at Windows on the World. Please call. The preschool was a block north of the wooden police barricades that separated regular life from the crumbled heap of buildings and the endless black smoke. Her stroller rattled past them and through the doors of the preschool. The school staff floated around, greeting everyone with an unnerving intimacy by their first names. Sammy darted into his classroom, and she stood with a cloud of mothers. They had walked to school under the smoky, foul skies, wearing leather coats in blue and orange. It seemed a paltry, mean decision, deciding what to wear, waking up and hearing the broken buildings falling into the boats. They had decided to dress up. Their hair was frosted golden and brown, and they were beautiful, and when they left, they cupped hands over their mouths. "Have you gone out to dinner yet?" she heard one mother ask another. "You wouldn't believe the good deals down here, plus you can get reservations. Prix-fixe at Chanterelle, $35, incredible, plus you have money for a good bottle of wine." "The Independence has a special, eat American," said another. "The waitstaff is fast and gracious. They have most exquisite apple pie." Clarissa closed her eyes and rubbed her face, wondering if she should admire these mothers' resilience or be appalled. "She was refugees at the plaza," she heard another mother say. "They had a special for everyone living below Canal. We had to go. Our place was covered in dust. We started throwing up, and I knew we had to get out. It cost a ton to get it cleaned. Should we stay or go? Can someone just tell me?" She whirled around, looking. A teacher came by. "The children are doing well," she said. "Do you want to say bye before you go?" Now Clarissa swerved through the room like a drunken person. Your child was not in the world, and then he was, suddenly, part of it. She crouched and breathed his clean, heartbreaking smell. "I'm going by," she said. Her child ignored her. Slowly, she stood up. In the office off the main hallway, the in-house psychologist was holding a drop-in support session in which parents could talk about their feelings about sending their children to preschool 3 blocks from the site. Clarissa stood with the group clustered around the psychologist. One mother said, "My child screamed the whole way here, saying she was scared and didn't want to go. And I dropped her off, but then I wonder, is she right to be scared?" "Why is she right?" asked the psychologist. "Well, because," called Clarissa from the back. "You have to believe it is safe," said the psychologist. "You tell them a kid's job is to go to school and a parent's job is to keep you safe." "But what if we don't know if it's safe?" Clarissa asked. "Where is it safe?" the psychologist said. "Here? Brooklyn? Vermont? Milwaukee?" The parents leaned toward her, awaiting an answer. "You have to tell them a little lie," the psychologist said. I'm going to stop here. Thanks. Thank you. So the rest of the story goes on with Kim demanding more and more of a refund, and then the reason she wants the refund is linked to something else that happened in the attack. So it goes on. Thank you. So I guess any questions? Happy to answer.
I can start.
Okay.
Karen.
Okay.
Did you, is this one of the older stories in the collection, or?
Probably. I mean, I wrote this probably around 2002, 2003. I mean, this was based somewhat on, we had lived in Tribeca, not far from the World Trade Center, and so when that happened, it was one of those things where, as a writer, the whole thing was so overwhelming and so hard to process. The only way I could really cope with it was to write about it, and to write notes and to sort of try to figure it out. I mean, you can't figure it out, but you can kind of try and grapple with it. So it probably is like around 2002 or 2003, yeah.
And so you answered my next question.
Yeah.
The research. So.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to do with this story is, how do you write about really big events that happen in the world, that are hard to write about? And I think, for me, part of it was trying to find the very flawed and human ways people react to things that are not always the predictable ways, the ways that are noble or, expected. And this story is actually about grief and different ways people grieve, Yeah.
So I have a question about having a collection of short stories, some that are written really far apart but connected by a theme.
Yeah.
Do you find that the theme has changed as you write about it through time, as you maybe have a different relationship to things like debt or money as you get older? And if so, how has that changed? And if not, is there some kind of unifying perspective that the collection has?
It's a great question. I mean, it's true. I mean, I'm a different person now than I was when I started the book, but in some ways similar. I mean, I don't think we've necessarily figured out money issues in our family. It's still something it seems to be just around and present. I mean, I think some of the stories were written with the idea of money in mind, some were not. I think I tend to write with something that I feel very strongly about and I want to figure out. I want to kind of teach myself about. So, I think all of these stories were related to that, and then some of them were not actually sort of focused on money, but we kind of tweaked them, so maybe they did. Like one story, which actually is not about money at all, but is about a family that has a kind of a lunch that goes awry. It's like a Jewish family in North Carolina. It's invited to a lunch with a Hasidic family, and it kind of goes a little awry. And the way we tweaked that one is we called it free lunch. And so it was kind of, which it was a free lunch. And actually that was sort of important to them. So maybe it does relate a little bit. But I mean, I think I just write stories because I want to express something. And it's the form, you can write, I think any kind of content you have as a writer finds its own form. The novels that I wrote, I didn't actually intend to be novels first. I started them as stories, but then they sort of explode into novels. But then most of my, I guess, ideas find themselves most happily in the form of a story. So I don't think you have to be like, I guess, sort of encaged within a theme, too.
More questions or comments? Karen, I've experienced financial stress, and I kind of deal with it by laughing crazily, when the situation comes up.
Sure.
But I was struck by I've read 2 or 3 of the stories before. I haven't gotten very far, but I found them very funny.
Oh,
I mean,
good.
they were horrible things were going on, but the humor I just thought was delightful.
Oh, thank you.
And I recognize kind of that. The necessary relief.
Yeah, well, I mean, in writing about money or financial issues or, transactions, you really see money is just a very it's a metaphor in a lot of things in stories. And it's about, feeling robbed or feeling like you have, all these verbs, robbed or stealing or investing all relate to emotions, And so I think thinking about how that can relate to the content is interesting. And I think it all ultimately is kind of, I think it's funny because the contrast between human feelings and situations that are, personal can be very deep and real, and money is ultimately pretty superficial. So I think that's where a lot of the humor comes in.
Hi, Karen.
Hi.
Thanks for coming back to I Was Sitting.
Hi.
I have a question about your revision process.
Okay.
And I'm wondering sort of if you could talk a little bit about your initial impulse and your investigation, and then how you go about revising and completing a piece.
Just any story, kind of, yeah. Yes, I'm a huge believer in revision. I feel like revision is what separates, a writer that finishes, that publishes, that finishes from a writer that doesn't. I think it is all about revision, and, that taking really just patience is, I think, one of these things that's very undervalued in our culture. And I think there's a big myth that you will write something suddenly and it'll be perfect. And sometimes you feel bad when it is not. So I think with all these things, if you get it down and then just realize it is a first step in it, and save as is this wonderful element on the computer, which we didn't when I was in the workshop, we didn't have. You know, it was typewriters, or I guess it was computers, but I mean, it's the process of saving and revising is so easy on a computer. Just having the patience to try things out and realizing there's more and more of it in you. Like, I think that the idea that you don't cut something because you feel it's good is a bad one. I think feeling you can cut anything is actually what you need to do, because it's actually sort of trusting that you have a lot of wealth. You know, you have all this creativity in you, and that you don't need to hoard anything, right? Because you also don't know where something will go if you let it go somewhere unexpected. You know, some of the stories I wrote and they didn't have that much revision, or some of them had a great deal of revision, and I just think, you know, realizing the value of cutting, you know, just getting it out and realizing, you know, how you cut it is so important. Changing a point of view, I think, is incredibly important. You know, just layering, realizing that I think a character reveals him or herself over drafts. I think through looking at different kinds of emotion. You know, like I'd have a draft and the character would be maybe one thing, like they'd be mad, you know, or they'd be sad. But then you go through and you're like, how do I, you know, layer another emotion in? You know, how do you, you know, and then, you know, how do you layer maybe, you know, some, you know, a little lighter feeling in? I think it's just realizing that it's a living thing, a story, and that you can really, if you allow yourself to stay with it, it will go places that you never thought it would. You know, none of my stories I ever thought I would be able to write. I mean, it's so hard. It's so hard. But I think, you know, and it's one of those things that you can control as a writer too. You know, that actually staying with the story over many drafts is something that you can do. You know, no one is saying, no one's taking it from you. You know, sometimes you wish they would, but that's one thing that you can really protect. So, yeah, so I think that is all of it, really.
Do you feel that the act of public reading of a story is also a chance to revise? Because I was following along and you did make changes, a number of changes, and funny. Yeah, I mean, I definitely edit the story for reading because I feel like there's some things that slowed down a bit, and also just reading a book published, sometimes I'll think I wish I'd changed that. You know, I'm not done with any of these stories ever. You know, so I think publishing is one way. It's kind of a stop, and then you move on to your next project, but it's all kind of artificial. I mean, there is no official state that says your story is now finished. Bing, you know. Sadly, you really, at a certain point, just have to decide, I've had it, you know. And that's kind of one of the mysterious and frustrating things about writing, is that you really are the boss. You decide when to do it, and you decide when to stop, and then you have to suffer the consequences of people saying this, you know, we don't like this part, you know, when you've said that. So it is one of those hard things about it. Yeah. More questions, comments?
Thank you. I had a question, I guess, about the setting of Refund.
Mm-hmm.
The whole, like, 9/11 period, it's at that weird, like, precipice where I lived through it, but it's also something I experienced as primarily secondhand. And one thing I found interesting, and I hope I'm quoting you semi-accurately here, you talked about how there was, like, this police line that separated, this place of normalcy between what I believe you referred to as a war zone. Is that? Yeah. I guess my question is, I've sort of noticed that sort of like framing of the situation, like what I've read and experienced about the whole affair before, and what I was wondering is what made it specifically like feel like that to you?
Feel like a war zone?
Yeah.
I mean, I think because it looked like, I guess the way it looked was so different. Like you had a building that was there, and you go down the street, and the building was just a heap. You know, and it felt like, you know, something really terrible had happened, you know. And I think, I mean, that's the character's perception too. that's from her point of view.
Yeah.
So I think, I think also the fact that, I mean, this isn't actually this isn't in this story, but, I remember there are all these posters from different countries that were you look back at that, it's so ironic, after everything that happened with the U.S. and foreign policy after, but how the whole world was really supportive in this way. It was interesting. So there was this feeling, that something bad had happened, so I think there was that too.
This is a little off topic, but do you have what's your ideal space or your ideal atmosphere for writing? The place where you can be the most efficient, if it's in a coffee house or in your office or under a tree somewhere?
What a great question. I think, I actually have this little essay I wrote about my hope for a room of my own, which I never actually have ever had. When I was younger, I shared a room my whole life with one of my sisters, and then I went to college, I had roommates, and I had actually when I lived in Iowa City, I lived on my own in an apartment on Lynn Street for 2 years, which was so wonderful. And then I moved to New York and I lived in Williamsburg by myself a little bit, and then I moved in with my husband. And we're both writers, and we're actually all both, working at home a lot, and and then I realized actually the room of my own is actually in my head. It's something that I have to, it's a perception that I have to have, because I never actually have had one. I've always wanted one. So right now, the place where I work, which is the room of my own in my head, is a desk in our bedroom. And it's just and I think what I like is to have just, to have quiet. I mean, when before we had kids, I would try and write in the morning, or whenever I wasn't doing a job to support the writing, or night. I mean, it basically is my feeling about writing is just you do it whenever you can, and you just find a way to do it. I personally, and I have written in college, when our son was little, sometimes I would run out to a coffee shop and write. I would actually go we were by Manhattan Community College, where they had a library, and so I'd pretend I was a student and go in and go to the library and write. And so I guess wherever you can do it. When our kids were little, I would write when they would nap. So quiet is important to me, and actually not having people around is generally a good thing. But otherwise, I will do it wherever. And I think there's a certain desperation to that, which sometimes I think is sort of good. Because then when you actually sit down to write, it just feels like such a relief. And I did find that when we had kids, my time was so when I got time to write, it was so precious, and just so wonderful. I didn't I didn't kind of waste time the way I did before somewhat, so it was helpful. But I think, just the more you can pressure, you can just, the more you just feel you need to do it and find a place to do it is good.
Karen, based on what you said about the form of the short story, will the next book be another collection, or do you have something else in the works?
That's a good question. I mean, right now, I'm just feeling so happy with the sorts, just now I'm doing it, and I just feel finally there's a book. And I love my publisher, Counterpoint. They've been very supportive. So I feel like you kind of just have to see where your next idea takes you. So I have some ideas for stories that I'm working on, and I'm kind of just seeing where they go. And then I, have an idea for a novel maybe. But yeah, I think you just have to see what is the question I want to answer. That's the thing I have to figure out myself. What is the next question I want to answer for myself? And then you use the work to figure it out.
And who are you reading?
Oh, I'm reading. Oh, so many people. I just read this great book by Anne Enright, who's an Irish writer who won the Booker Prize in 2007, I think, called The Gathering, which is a great novel about a family. I read My Struggle by Nosgard, which I really love him. I think he's a really beautiful writer, though. It's interesting because Anne Enright writes about similar issues of family and childcare and stuff, which I think is interesting to compare them, the two writers. And who else am I reading? I read Hilton Al's White Girls, his essay collection, which was just beautiful and really compelling. Who else? I'm reading Leslie Jameson, The Empathy Exams, which are just like, just so great. Like, you think, what are the writers that are saying things that are not what you're expected to feel, or not the ways that sort of you're expected to kind of perceive things, and those are I think that's what as a writer you want to do, is you want to see how people wake you up, and how they kind of wake you up in your through their honesty, how they kind of shake you out of, perceived ideas about things, and, all those writers are doing that for me, so, yeah, thanks. Oh.
Hi. And in fact, I really like writing, and I try to write self-fiction. However, usually my writing collection is from the real life. So after I showed my work to my peers, and they said it's non-fiction. So I want to know how did you create me characteristics and develop the stories?
Oh, interesting. Like, how do you transform nonfiction into fiction? What a great question. I think a lot of my stories come from something that was real that I was trying to kind of figure out, and then I start transforming them. I think what you do is you give yourself permission to lie, which is like the great thing about fiction writing, is that you don't have to, use the truth, or you can in certain ways, but you also don't need it. So I think letting yourself exaggerate. You have a character, the character of Kim in this story, starts, asking for a refund, and then gets kind of more and more extreme as the story goes on. She becomes, and then at the end, something happens that reveals something, surprising about her. And I think I kind of discovered that about her through just the writing of it. But I think just letting your characters reveal all of their elements, and not feel they have to, kind of cleave to the truth of how people act, I think, and just trusting your subconscious, because your subconscious is really the truest part of yourself as a writer. It's the part of you that dreams. It's a part of you that takes the most important things that are most important to you, and then, puts them forward. So I think trusting what your characters do and say without you trying to control them is helpful. Does that make sense? Like, and not feeling like you have to, have anything that really happened in your story, because that's nonfiction. I mean, not fiction, that's a great thing, you can abandon all of it.
Thank you. Hi, so when you're writing story, I want to ask, do you have all the storyline in your mind before you write it? Or you just start writing when you have anything you have a character, so you just start writing, or you plan think about the whole story, or when you write?
That's a great question. Am I a planner,
Yeah.
or sort of do I find my way through the darkness?
Yeah. So when
groping. Yeah, it's a great question. So
because sometimes when I'm writing, I find myself spend more time thinking than writing.
Oh, both are helpful.
Too much time thinking about it, but not actually write about it.
Every writer is very different. Some writers really like to have a very clear, plot or plan outline even before they start writing for certain stories. I mean, I tend not to be that type. I tend to maybe have part of it that I know. I maybe know the end, maybe I know the beginning, or I know a section, and then I kind of dive in and just flail around, which is not the most efficient way to write, but it's sort of the way that I do it. I think there's a lot to be said to writing outside of a story. You feel like you're starting a story and you don't know something about a character, but to go and, write about a character's backstory, that won't be in the story, but, might inform the story in some way is helpful. But yeah, I think every writer is different in that way. I find if I have a plot, sometimes it's kind of helpful just to give myself some sort of framework to go on, because I think one of the hardest things about writing is uncertainty. you know, that you have no map. You know, you create the map. So I think I think to have an outline could be helpful, but I also think you don't want to feel burdened by it. Because your story can suddenly take this really interesting, odd turn that you didn't expect, you know, and then, you're carefully, set up dominoes are not useful at all. So, but one thing I do with the story, and this is one thing I think about plot, is I think what question is the story going to answer? And I feel like there are two types of questions that a story answers. One is the horizontal question, which is what happens. Like in this story, what will happen with the refund? Will they give her a refund? It's kind of the plot question that fuels the story. And then there's the vertical question, which is emotional question. And that is, what does this mean to the character? How are these characters going to sort of, kind of emotionally figure out their lives? So I feel like there are a couple of questions that kind of help shape the story, but may not, that I think can help kind of structure it. So I do think about that when I write, is what is the main question of the story?
More questions or comments for Karen? If not, the book is Refund. Let's thank Karen Bender.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Thanks so much.